So hello everyone, my name is Alexis Glennon and I am the field director here at Union Institute and University in the Division of Social Work. So welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn Diversity series. We're here today to talk about developing professional anti-racist practices in the workplace. Our presenter today is Michelle Patak Petrofesa, and she is a PhD candidate at Ohio State University and is an LISWS with over 10 years of practice experience in community-based mental health, school social work, and private practice. She has presented several workshops and trainings on the topic of racial bias at local, state, and national conferences, and is currently working on her dissertation that explores the relationship between teacher racial bias and student outcomes in elementary school settings. So welcome, Michelle, and I'm going to hand over the floor to you.
Thank you so much for having me today and inviting me to come and talk about this topic. Again, my name is Michelle Pietrofesa. I'm working on my PhD in the College of Social Work at Ohio State. And as Alexis mentioned, my dissertation looks at racial bias within K through 12 education settings and how it impacts the perspectives of teachers and the teacher-student relationships and the outcomes that come from that. So today I'm going to be talking about how to develop anti-racist practices within the workplace. And although I'm going to be talking to you about anti-racist practices today, I first want to acknowledge that as a white presenting individual, my knowledge of this topic does not come from my own experiences. I do not pretend to know what it feels like to be oppressed or worse because of the color of my skin. So what I share with you today comes from the expertise of the activists, the scholars, the historians, and other people of color who have been doing this work long before me. So if you have not already, I really encourage you to seek out the work of those experts as you continue your learning on this topic. And to help you along your way, I've provided some great resources that you can look to at the end of this presentation. So with that, we will get started. So we will start off today by exploring the concepts of social identity, privilege, and oppression. Then we'll talk about how racial biases are developed and evolve into prejudice and discrimination. We'll also unpack why it's so hard for people to talk openly about race. And we'll wrap up with things we can do to dismantle racial bias within the context that we live and work. So even though this workshop is online, it's going to be interactive. There will be discussion prompts throughout for which I'll be calling on each of you to share your thoughts. So let's get started. So just kidding, first of all, when I said that it would be interactive, that is true, it will be interactive, but when I said that you'll be called on to share your thoughts, that part was not true. So it will be interactive, but I will not be calling on you directly to share your thoughts. To interact, you'll go to this website here that you see on the screen, menti.com, and type in the code that you see there, so 976504. All of your responses to the prompts throughout the conversation today will be anonymous. Your name's not going to be attached to it unless you type your name. And the video and audio should be anyway disabled so that only my face and voice are the ones that you will hear, and Alexis, of course. So go ahead and go to this website now and type in that code. And the reason why I scared you at first is because I'd like to hear your thoughts or feelings that initially came up for you when you thought you were going to be called on directly to give your thoughts about our topic today. So first things that popped into your head when I said you're going to be called on to talk about this stuff. Does everyone see a browser pop up on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. We'll give people time to respond. Anxious, yes, very common. And shy, nervous, Yeah. Interested. Good. Anxious. So the more times, I'm sure you've seen word clouds before, but the more times people respond with the same words, that word gets bigger. So anxious is the biggest word right now. Hopeful. Good. Stress. Yeah, these are all, you can keep putting answers in as I talk. I'd love to hear how you're feeling when I said that at the beginning. All of these feelings so far are really common. In fact, I've seen people type, "Oh crap, oh no, please don't make me do that." Most people have a really hard time talking openly about race. So, although you won't be having conversations about race today, there is a chance that you might feel uncomfortable at one point or another. So, I'm really asking you to just make room for that discomfort, because being willing to experience the discomfort, that is an absolutely necessary step toward dismantling systemic racism. Another foundational step is building self-awareness around your own identities and privilege. So as we grow up, our experiences and our perspectives shape how we see the world, and how the world sees us also shapes our perspectives. So prior to coming today, you should have received an email with this worksheet in it that you see on the screen that has this image, and this is a social identity wheel. So on the wheel, there are multiple different types of identities that we might claim for ourselves or that others might ascribe to us. So if you still have Menti open, it should show up the next screen. If you closed out of Menti, go ahead and type that code again, because I'd like to get a sense of what identities are the most prominent for each of you for each of these questions here. Let me pull this up. So I did that one already. Okay. So out of all of the identities on the social identity wheel, which identities do you think about most often? And I believe you can add, or you can check the box for up to 3 identities. Gender, race, socioeconomic status. They're tied. Sexual orientation, age. 3 people for race, 3 people for gender. Okay, so religious or spiritual affiliation, good. Okay. So as you can see, race and gender are the identities that most of you, and socioeconomic status, okay, that most of you think about most often, which makes sense because those are typically the identities that people can see. Those are the first things that others notice about us when we interact with them. Okay, for the next one, which of your identities do you think about least often? It should be the same process. There we go. Okay. Ability, first language, age. For some people, yeah, age is not immediately clear. Socioeconomic status, national origin or citizenship. Okay, so far, first language and ability are the identities that most of you think about least often. And that makes sense, right? So first language and ability, a lot of times there are certain disabilities that might be hidden. So those wouldn't be immediately apparent when we interact with other people. Okay. So how about the identities that you believe have the strongest effect on how you see yourself? Okay, gender is the winner here. And to flip things a little bit, which of your identities has the strongest effect on how others perceive you? Okay. Gender, race, age. that looks similar to the patterns we saw at the beginning with the identities that were easily identifiable, visually identifiable. So some of these identities we feel and express regularly, while others we may not feel them regularly, or we may not be aware of them as often. And in some contexts, one identity might be highlighted when in other contexts that identity is hidden. It's the normalization of some identities over others that creates privilege in our society. So going to a drugstore and easily finding a Band-Aid that matches your skin color, or getting pulled over by the police for a minor traffic violation and not having to worry about being deported, wearing whatever you want without having to worry about being catcalled or sexually harassed. All of these experiences are examples of the benefits that result from having a privileged identity. So one of the ways that you can explore your privilege further is online quizzes like this. Now, it is an online quiz, so take it with a grain of salt, but this quiz in particular, how privileged are you, can help you consider privileges that you might not have been aware of. So basically, you just check off all of the statements that apply to you. So I am white, I would check that off. I have never been discriminated against because of my skin color, I would check that off. The more things that apply to you, the more privilege you have. The score is out of 100, and you will, at the end when you complete it, you get a description of your level of privilege at the end, and you'll also get a little image here that shows you how your privilege compares to the privilege of other people who've taken this. So again, it's an internet quiz. It's not, based in research or anything like that, but it can help you build some insight into privileges that you didn't realize that you had. The main privilege that we're going to be focusing on today, of course, is white privilege. And as short as it is, that two-word term can create some really, really strong pushback. Just the word white can create discomfort among those who are not used to being defined or described by their race. And the word privilege might feel like a word that doesn't really belong to those who experience poverty, because the word privilege suggests that someone has not struggled. But the term white privilege is often misinterpreted. It doesn't mean that white people have never struggled. There are, of course, many white folks who struggle quite severely in our society. But the thing to remember is that it usually is not because of the color of their skin that they're struggling. And white privilege is also not the assumption that everything a white person has accomplished is unearned. In fact, white people who have accomplished success or wealth often have worked very hard to get there. So a lot of people get defensive when they hear white privilege, again, because they think that that means that they haven't struggled, or that that means that what they have not worked for, and that is not the case. What white privilege means is that on the road to accomplishments in life, we all have different starting points. So just like you see in the picture here, there's a race. We all have different starting points. The finish line might be at the same point for everyone, even if we have the exact same goals as another person, but some people start much further back. Some have many more barriers to getting to the finish line than others, and the more privileged identities an individual has, the shorter and straighter their path is to the finish line. Privilege can also be so powerful that it can actually be used as a weapon. So it's both unconsciously and consciously enjoyed and perpetuated. It's both on the surface and deeply embedded in our life. It's a weightless knapsack and a weapon, and it really depends on who's carrying it in terms of how it's used. So does everyone remember this video went viral a while back? If you're not familiar with the video, this was released on the exact same day as George Floyd's murder. And what happens in the video is Christian Cooper, who is a black man, asked this white woman to leash her dog in the park, which was the law. She became extremely angry and threatened to call the cops and tell them that an African American was threatening her life. This story is the epitome of white privilege being used as a weapon. She is, if you watch the video, she's clearly aware that if she calls the police and tells them that a black man is threatening the life of a white woman, it will not end well for him. So for those of us who are white, we first have to recognize and understand the privilege that we have, and then decide to use that privilege for good rather than to do harm. So, how might we start to become aware of our privilege? We start by understanding the cycle of socialization. So, those of you who are in social work and are watching this today, a lot of this you probably learned, or hopefully you learned in your program so far. So this will be a refresher. But for those of you who don't come from social work, you may or may not already be aware of how this works. So we're born into this world without any assumptions, opinions, or biases, and we don't get to choose what circumstances we're born into. But those circumstances start to shape us, whether we like it or not. And that is called primary socialization. So those around us teach us social norms, values, beliefs, rules, and expectations, and they can teach those things either directly or indirectly. Then as we get older and start to interact with institutions in society, our norms, values, beliefs, rules, and expectations are either challenged or they're reinforced by those institutions. The institutions can be, as you can see the icons here, the sports leagues that we pay attention to, the legal system, media, MTV, churches, schools, the police. All of those are institutions that we interact with as members of society. Those interactions, those experiences that you have with the institutions, along with the messages you receive from the people you interact with, create you. They shape your identity and how you see the world. So with this understanding of how we came to see the world the way that we do, we can choose to do something or nothing with it. We can be silent, choose not to question the status quo or not to challenge ourselves or others to think differently. For many people, we have the privilege to choose to do nothing, and the wheels keep turning regardless. On the other hand, we can choose to do differently. We can choose to be the change that we hope to see, which is something we say a lot in social work, is be the change you want to see in the world. We can take a stand or a knee. We can interrupt when we hear a biased comment. We can reframe something that we've heard and help others see things differently. We can question, we can challenge, we can educate, we can protest, we can boycott, and probably the biggest thing we can do is to vote and to communicate what we want to see in the world to our elected officials. So whether we choose to do nothing or to be the change that we want to see, the gears keep turning regardless. Both our actions and our interactions continue to influence the rest of the system. What if we pretend that that day in the park, Christian Cooper did not have his camera phone with him and the white woman called the police on him? Think about how the narrative that showed up in the media afterward could have been very different if he didn't have his phone with him. Since the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and countless others, nationwide conversations about institutional racism have brought the term implicit bias to the forefront. I'm sure most people have heard this term by now at some point, but implicit biases are automatic assumptions or stereotypes that we have developed over time that help our brains make assessments quickly. These assessments happen automatically and usually operate outside of our conscious awareness, which means we don't always have control of them. It's important to remember that our brains really like efficiency, and our brain is always trying to optimize processing speed. So one of the ways that it does that is by chunking information into categories or groups. So when you think of this from an evolutionary perspective, this is really beneficial because it allows us to, let's say, walk in a room and know immediately that the chair we see is for sitting in, not eating. The chair doesn't have to have a specific pattern on the fabric or doesn't have to be a specific size for us to know that it's a member of the chair family. Stereotypes are the categories that our brains create about people, and these categories, just like the category when we look at something as a chair, can be very helpful. So let's say we are walking down the street in public and we fall and get injured. we see somebody walking by wearing hospital scrubs and maybe a stethoscope around their neck, we might immediately assume that that person has some kind of medical training and therefore will know what to do without us having to interview them. Unless they're an actor and they play a doctor on TV, most of the time we can assume correctly that that person probably has some medical training. On the other hand, when it comes to the stereotypes our brains create about people, sometimes these automatic categorizations can override what we cognitively know to be true and even lead us to act on our biases. Research tells us that our brains are more likely to rely on these automatic categorizations under specific circumstances. So usually when we are overwhelmed, when we're stressed, when we're fatigued, or when we feel threatened or unsafe. So those are the times you really have to be careful about your brain relying on these biases. Those are times when it's more likely for that to come out. But guess what? Everyone has biases of some type. Nobody is immune to these. We can even have biases about things that we don't even believe to be true, as I said in the last slide. So for example, I grew up with dogs as pets. And I have very positive experiences with dogs. I did have a cat once, and that cat was a jerk. It always had an attitude and acted like it was too cool to be someone's pet. It rarely let me pet it. Since then, I have never again attempted to have a cat as a pet. So that means, though, my only experience with cats was with the rude cat that I had as a kid. I didn't realize it until a couple years ago. I didn't realize that I had developed a bias about cats until after I met my current boss and found out she had 7 cats. So after working with her for about a week, she somehow mentioned how many cats she had, and I immediately responded with, "Ew, why?" Luckily, she laughed and was not offended by that. And I was quite surprised at how quickly I responded that way because I didn't consciously think that I disliked cats. I realized that because I had never had any positive experiences with cats to counteract the negative experiences I had with my cat as a kid, that made me create that automatic categorization of cats equals ew, why would anyone want a cat, let alone 7? So we can have implicit biases that we're not aware of. We can say things that reflect our biases without us even realizing it. And research has shown for years that across many different contexts, implicit bias has led to discriminatory actions against people of color in particular, including healthcare settings with healthcare providers discounting patients' reports of pain and not giving proper treatment to treat that pain. Managers offering lower salaries due to biases they might have about the person's professional worth. Courtroom decisions being influenced by a judge or jury's biases. Of course, police officers' choices around the use of force. And within the context that I'm most familiar with, schools. A study with preschoolers showed precisely how racial bias can operate in the classroom and lead to discrimination. In this study that I'm talking about, teachers were asked to watch a group of normally behaving preschool students for a period of time, and they were asked to take note of all behavior problems that the students exhibited. The researchers then tracked the teachers' eye movements during this task and found that teachers spent significantly more time looking at students of color than white students, even though in the experiment none of the students were misbehaving. This finding most likely suggests that teachers were expecting misbehavior to occur in students of color and much less so in white students. So if this is the case, that these teachers were expecting misbehavior from the students of color, then to counteract those biases, they would have to spend some time understanding where those biases come from and how to make sure that their decisions and interactions with such students were not impacted by those biases. So again, you might not be directly responsible for having developed racial biases or any biases, but you are responsible for preventing that bias from turning into prejudice and discrimination. So this is an old poster that was put out by the American Red Cross. It's a great example of how bias can sneak into our communications with others without us realizing it. So take a minute to look at the poster in detail, and if you see any ways that bias has snuck in, go to menti.com again and type in a quick description of what you see. So at the top, the tagline is that it's cool to follow the rules. So I want to know, when you look closer at this poster, what do you see? And I'll pull the poster back up so you can see it. Anything that you see in this poster that looks like someone's biases might have snuck through, just type a brief description of that in Menti. Let me see if we have some responses to look at. Yes. Okay, so the first response we have, everyone labeled not cool appear to be people of color. Yes. Yep. Most of the not cool arrows point to people of color. People of color are depicted as breaking the rules. The cool people are white. Black kids are not cool and doing problematic behaviors. Absolutely.
So back in 2014, the Red Cross released this pool safety poster in which they have a diverse group of kids displaying what are some good things and what are some not so good things to do at the pool. This poster received a huge amount of backlash on Twitter for being subtly racist. I will say for myself, when I first saw the poster, I immediately had an idea as to what the criticism was going to be about. With that, I decided to then play a little game with my coworkers called Can You See What I See? So here's the thing. We all grew up and came from different backgrounds. And so that means that we're all going to have varying perspectives when it comes to looking at the same situation. So with that in mind, I gave my coworkers a copy of this little poster here, and I told them to tell me what they see.
I see a sign that says, be cool, follow the rules.
They've got these little arrows of kids that say like cool and not cool.
And then I don't know what this kid's doing. It looks like he's drowning, which I don't know. Yeah, you're right. That's not cool.
Oh, it's just people having fun in a pool, trying to decipher the deeper meaning of this.
Why are all the not cool kids black?
I don't even know what they're doing that isn't cool.
Literally the only cool ones are this white female about to go on the diving board and another like white dad.
Okay, so there is one not cool white dude who's drinking a beer.
I think I need better directions of like what is not cool. Like this drawing is garbage, period.
When I went to go look in the comment section of the article, there were a lot of people who not only couldn't see what I saw, but were refusing to see what I saw.
I think people that don't see it as a problem are the people that are pouring it as cool. You know, they're like, oh, what? Who cares about skin color? I don't deal with it.
If you see this and you're like, racism doesn't happen, this is just a cartoon, like you're not seeing what's out there. And what's out there is really scary, especially right now with what's going on in our country. We're allowing these small little things like this to become normal.
Being a white guy, I look to the white faces in the photo and go, oh, they're having fun at the pool, I'll have fun at the pool. I can only imagine being in someone else's shoes and looking at this and going, oh, well, the people I identify with in this photo are not cool. They're troublemakers.
If you're the ones who are constantly being pointed, you're the bad people, like you do bad things, like, yeah, it'll piss you off.
Racism starts small. And having good people that don't mean to be racist, but like this is either neglect or we're purposefully and intentionally choosing to depict minorities in a certain way.
So back in 2014, the Red Cross released this pool safety poster in which they have
a lot of backlash.
a diverse group of
people might have been upset about it.
I feel like I should be able to see it.
There we go.
Oh. Like, you look at it and you're like, great, diversity. They show all different kinds of people.
I mean, it's got white, black, all different races, plus a whale. But also, we still have our associations of what has been embedded in our consciousness for like decades.
Also ties in how Asian people aren't really seen in media. Like, you can literally have a whale floating, blowing a whistle, and not have an Asian person.
It's disappointing that something that's portrayed as taking a couple steps forward when really it isn't showing much progress at all.
I don't think that the Red Cross is a racist organization, nor do I think that they had racist intentions when making this poster. But I do think that it's important for us as a society to acknowledge the fact that we've all been socialized to believe certain things about different groups of people. And that if we don't take the time to acknowledge them, then that can affect our perspective when doing our jobs, like making this poster, or when it comes to policing a neighborhood. But that being said, if we can take the time to challenge those biases, we can be better than our socializations.
Okay. So if you work for an agency or institution that pushes anything out to the public, take a minute to think about what underlying messages might be conveyed. Posters like this are often produced by people who truly did not intend for that message to be conveyed, but the automatic categorization happening in their brain translated to this very biased image. And although most people would be uncomfortable confronting the creator of this poster,
so back in 2014, the Red Cross. So back in 2014, the Red Cross released this pool safety poster in which they have a...
Okay, let's try this again. Okay. So most people would be uncomfortable confronting the creator about this poster. If you saw this poster come across your desk, it might be a little uncomfortable to say to the person, hey, there is a serious issue with this. But we have to push through that discomfort to stop a message like this from perpetuating bias. Okay, so another activity, let's see, to explore any possible biases that you might have. So picture this scene. You are waiting on the subway platform amongst a crowd of people to board the morning train on your way to work. Suddenly, a person rushes onto the train, pushing past everyone else. So, before we even see or hear any more information about this situation, our brain puts a picture in our head. It goes through our past experiences of waiting for the subway or of being pushed by someone in a hurry. Or if we haven't experienced that exact situation, we might draw it from what we were taught by the people around us and what we see and saw in the media. When you first pictured this scenario in your head, what were you picturing? So I'd like to hear what was the image that came up in your head? What was the person who pushed past everyone? What was their age? What was their race? What was their gender? What were they wearing? Where were they going, possibly? I'd like to see where your brains took this. So the first person thought it was a white man. Another person thought it was a white man in a suit. A teenager. White guy in a suit, okay. Young adult white man, yeah. So these responses really point out that, again, everybody has biases. We all make automatic assumptions about what's happening and what we see going on around us. And that means our brains are doing their job. They're supposed to categorize for us. It makes things process faster. But the problem is that our assumptions are not usually just based on the facts that our brain has gathered from the situation, and therefore sometimes they can be flat out wrong. Bias doesn't just lead to poor assumptions. Those assumptions can manifest in subtle discriminatory messages called microaggressions. So, does anyone recognize this woman? if you've never seen her before, because this article came out several years ago, her name is Dr. Tamika Cross, and she was on a Delta flight when a passenger collapsed. When the flight attendant used the intercom to ask if there were any physicians on board, Dr. Cross offered to help, but the flight attendant rejected her offer and said she needed an actual physician. So the flight attendant automatically assumed that Tamika couldn't possibly be a physician, and when she rejected Dr. Cross's assistance and said she needs an actual physician, that's an example of a microaggression. So if you haven't heard the term microaggressions before, they are brief, they're often subtle, can be verbal or behavioral messages that communicate to another person hostility or derogatory or negative insults, and it's usually towards someone with a marginalized identity. Microaggressions can be intentional or unintentional. They can be subtle or overt, and like I said, they're frequently based on assumptions about race, ethnicity, gender, income, disability, or other marginalized identity. So here are some examples of microaggressions. There's a website, it's listed on the screen, microaggressions.com, and you can go to that website and type in your own examples that have happened to you, or you can read examples that other people have typed in. So this is an example of a student who is a female Chinese American college student, and she noticed that on the first day the professor was trying to learn names and asked people when they speak to share their name, but did not ask students who appeared to be Asian to do the same. And she shares that it made her feel like she was less than a person and that her opinion didn't matter as much because of her race. This is another example from the classroom of a teacher referring to a Black student and saying, the only Black student in the class, "I'm sure you can speak to this." "May I help you?" came from a white man at Target when a Black girl approached her mother, who was white, and was trying to, she assumed that the white man thought she was trying to take something from her mother. I feel like people don't know about interracial adoption. This is a more overt microaggression. A substitute teacher to my class of English as a second language students saying, "So what, are you all Mexicans?" And the kids went and told her the next day. So some of these are more covert, they're not very direct, and some of them are overt, they're very direct, like this last one. But they may not be intentionally prejudiced, but the impact feels much the same because the comments like these usually highlight the otherness of the individual or point out that they are not part of the dominant group's culture. So a lot of times when someone says something offensive or uses a microaggression and tries to apologize, they might say, "Well, I didn't mean it like that." So let's talk about intention. When let's say you walk into the room and see, your favorite vase, it's the vase that your grandmother gave you, and you see it looking like this. It's demolished, it's broken. You are devastated and you want to know how it happened. Which scenario do you think would make you feel better about your vase being broken? If you found out that your partner intentionally broke the vase with the hammer you see there, or to find out that your partner was trying to hang a picture on the wall and accidentally knocked over the vase? Really, neither. Neither would make you feel that much better about the vase being broken, because regardless of how it happened, your cherished vase is still broken. The outcome is still the same. So intent is different than impact, that is true, but regardless, the outcome is the same. Although people who give a microaggression may not intend to be discriminatory, the impact to the person on the receiving end a lot of times feels the same. So when we see something like the Red Cross poster or witness a microaggression, we have several choices about how to respond. We all technically have the choice to ignore it or brush it off as not a big deal, but for some people, especially people of color, seeing every person that looks like you in a poster as being portrayed to behave badly, it is a big deal. And of course, it would be not easy to just brush that off. The ability to ignore the concept of race is not universal. Not everybody can just ignore it. So, although it might be uncomfortable and sometimes messy to talk about topics like privilege, racial bias, and discrimination, when we avoid talking about these sensitive topics, the white elephants in the room, they become even more taboo. If we're unwilling to take risks and talk about these topics, the learning that is absolutely necessary for those who experience white privilege will not occur. Those of us who have privilege, we have to learn this. We have to take the risks and make these topics not taboo. So as you move forward with starting to have these conversations, be prepared to experience discomfort, but at the same time, try to embrace it as growth, because dismantling systemic racism is simply not possible if we're not willing to talk about race. So why exactly is it difficult for people to talk about race? First, everybody is at a different level in their own racial and ethnic identity development, and therefore we all have different levels of self-awareness and understanding. So discussing race can really trigger people to feel the need to protect their identities. You might see this in let's say a white woman becomes angry when white privilege is brought up because she interprets that to mean that her Irish ancestors did not work hard for what they have. That's a true story. It happened in a women's issues class in my master's social work program. This woman was at a different point in her understanding of racial identity and socialization in our country. I don't know how her learning changed, but I hope it did with the challenges that happened in that classroom. So like that woman, talking about race can elicit feelings of shame, blame, and guilt, and those feelings quite often spark defensiveness and resistance toward growth. Just talking about people's differences can cause anxiety, and that usually happens because people are afraid to say the wrong thing or risk being called racist. But because the white experience in our society has been normed, we tend to refer to our own experiences when we try to understand the experiences of another person. But doing that often results in the invalidation of that other person's experience. And that invalidation a lot of times leads to tension in groups, and that tension can be a battleground for conflict. So it's not surprising that a lot of people shy away from these conversations, but ultimately being silent is not an option for a lot of people. So because most people are averse to conflict, silence is the option that a lot of people go for. It's a convenient way to avoid the conflict, and it also serves to protect our identity from being challenged. But silence really is one of the biggest barriers to progress. In fact, we have been socialized not to talk about race. You know, the colorblind ideology is a great example. We've been socialized to say that we don't see color. If you are really anti-racist, then you don't see color, you don't see people differently, you only see people. But if we don't see color, then we do not see systemic racism that is, in fact, still happening today. It took huge protests all over the country and nonstop media coverage for the NFL to admit that systemic racism exists and that they very much played a role in it when they ostracized Colin Kaepernick for kneeling. But now, because of all the media coverage of the protests and attention to this topic, talks like these are happening in institutions all over the country, and that's a great thing. On the surface, it might look like large-scale change is right around the corner, but there are no quick fixes, and there isn't one best workshop like this that will magically turn an institution anti-racist. So creating a truly anti-racist workplace takes ongoing commitment to growth from everyone at every level of the institution. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip past this. This is just an example of some of the reactions that people can have when you bring up race in certain contexts. This was in a school. So this is what I wanted to get to finish up. What can you do? On a personal level, you can, as I've mentioned earlier, begin to recognize and understand how your own privileged identities impact you and the world around you, understand what biases you may have developed and where they're most likely to come out and impact others. Challenge yourself regularly to practice self-awareness and to monitor your expression of those biases. If you do end up making a mistake, this is one of the most important pieces. Own it and apologize, regardless of whether it was intentional or not. So at the interpersonal level, in your interactions with other people at work, when you see or hear the bias of others coming out, if it's safe to do so, don't be silent about it. Take the opportunity to help them grow by pointing it out. Identify the specific behavior that you saw or words that you heard that were a problem, and decide what the best way to respond is. Say something, and then follow up with the person to check that they understood. Just the act of interrupting something can change social norms. Even creating a pause can be enough to force someone to think about what they just said, and that uncomfortable silence can be very powerful. Even in one-on-one conversation, you can challenge others to think differently. We will have a follow-up presentation to this one that goes into much more detail about those interpersonal conversations and how to be strategic about how you challenge someone, so stay tuned for that. And last, at the organizational level, when you're at work, if you work in a service providing agency, one of the things you can do is encourage administrators and managers to collect data to help identify racial disproportions in the provision of services. And even more importantly is to make sure that they actually review the data. There's some research showing that institutions that collect data about race, even when they collect that data, they don't look at it. So it's really important to collect the data and to review it. Collecting that data can also help your organization determine where the weak points are. Where is bias most likely to come out, and where is it most likely to impact other people? So for example, we know that fatigue and overwhelm causes our brains to rely on those automatic categorizations. So we might advocate that doctors and nurses' schedules be regulated and prevent them from working long hours overnight. We can also advocate that protocols be put in place at the decision points that are identified that will challenge thinking and prevent bias from impacting the outcomes. Going back to the Red Cross poster, there really needs to be several different people reviewing things like that before they go out to the public. This is why organizations usually have entire communications teams to make sure that the intended message is the only message conveyed. A relatively easy way to start ripping the Band-Aid of racial silence off and getting people at your agency to at least think more about race in society is to advocate that your agency participate in some sort of group volunteering event for a racial justice cause. With racial justice being at the forefront, a lot of agencies and organizations are looking for ways to show their support. So getting people to participate in service activities can bring them closer to that cause and at least forces them to acknowledge that there is a problem. So it's not really uncommon for there to be racial bias kind of plaguing a workplace setting. It can start with just one person having biases, and those biases can transfer across the social networks within agencies like a plague or a virus. So in nature, there's a certain order to things. I don't have time to show you this video, but the video is, in nature, there's an order to things. Groups tend to become in sync with each other just naturally over time. In the video, you see metronomes. There's 3 of them. They're all in sync. When one person is removed from that system, the metronomes go out of sync. Eventually, they come back in sync. When the middle metronome is returned, all 3 metronomes eventually get back to being in sync with each other. So that really drives the point home that you may feel like you are only one person in an agency, but just by changing your behavior in that system, it will impact all of the people around you. So never underestimate the power of just your own behaviors and actions in a workplace. And that is the end of that. Okay, so no matter how big the system is, you can still have an impact just with the small things that you do. So, as I said at the beginning, I was going to provide some resources of experts who've been doing this work long before I ever started. Some of the books that have really educated me on these topics are shown here on the screen. I really encourage you to check them out. There's lots of others that I didn't list, but these are some great ones to start with. There's also an evaluation that we would like you to fill out for today's workshop. Your answers are anonymous. The link for it is here, but you'll also get an email after the workshop is over with the link for you to access the form. And if you have any questions, I can take those now. So I believe Alexis is going to be monitoring the chat box.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. No questions have come in yet. But please, if you have questions, please send them in the chat and I can let Michelle know what they are.
And if you can't think of any questions right now, but you have them later, my contact information is here. Feel free to reach out to me. Also, I would love people's feedback on this presentation. I hope to give this type of presentation as many times as I can. So any feedback you have for me, you can email it to me or you can put it in the evaluation that you send. Again, it's anonymous, so unless you want to put your name, I will have no idea who filled it out. But I'd love to hear your perceptions of the talk today.
It doesn't look like anyone has any questions, but everyone is saying amazing content. Thank you for the workshop. Fantastic presentation. Found this extremely helpful. So a lot of appreciation and thanks coming your way.
Great. Well, thank you again very, very much for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. This was a wonderful introduction for us, and we are extremely excited to have you back to have some follow-up presentations that dive in deeper. So thank you for that offer as well.
Thank you. And if there's something in particular that you want to see in the next presentation or that you hope will be included, put it in the feedback form so we make sure to include that.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming. And again, thank you, Michelle. And we will all see you at our next Lunch and Learn Diversity series.
Bye.